Hello, my name is Daniel Keum. My topic is modern technology, the increase in violent video games realism, and its correlation with violence. This presentation was structured so that the audience can be users of a computer. My English professor, Professor Strona, has guided me throughout this process and presentation. The goal of this research is to understand the complex connotation regarding violent video games and derive a conclusion based on the evidence and facts. The basic overview of this presentation will show the first two apps. It will discuss and show the realism in violent video games and its correlation with Baudulard's ideologies. The next two apps will discuss and show cel-shaded animation. It will conclude with recent studies and studies regarding the horror virtual reality games. This is the first app. This is the second app talking about the realism in video games. The video gives an insight into the correlation between video games and violence. Users show their heightened emotions through their actions by throwing their controllers or cursing. Although they might overtly show their emotions for more views on their streams, it cannot be disregarded that their emotions are heightened from these video games. Mass media portrayed mass shooters as the epitome of gamers who played violent video games. They often state that these violent video games corrupt and erode their sense of ethical morality. Many politicians, such as Donald Trump, stated that we must stop the glorification of violence in our society. This includes the gruesome and grisly video games that are now commonplace. Tim 2. Many articles defend these politicians without any reliable information or misleading information. Articles from newspapers allow false information to circulate, as a reader cannot determine whether the article is the truth or just false information. Yet, recent research portrays that there is no distinct correlation to conclude that there is no correlation between violent video games and violence, but state that there are limitations in the research. Baudulard's ideologies. Hyperreality can be defined as a niche where society cannot determine what is truth and false. Baudulard 2. Baudulard discusses how the notion of simulacrum and its correlation with the current postmodern age is influencing society to strive for a false reality. Baudulard 2. Simulacrum is defined as society imitating reality through representations rather than the reality itself. It is trying to imitate it and eventually replaces reality. It stemmed from mass media masking reality was false information. As American society cannot discern the truth, they regress into a reality where they base reality from signs rather than the actual reality and fetishize an inanimate object. Campbell 6. From Baudulard's and Campbell's ideologies, the notion of hyperreality is becoming America's reality. The false reality gives an insight into the fetishization of weaponry, especially guns. The fetishization of guns has many of the politicians emphasizing the power of weaponry and manipulating the masses to a false reality. Campbell 5. As society is signifying weaponry as power and strength, it replaces reality with symbolism. Majority of the entertainment, like video games and movies, give an insight into their fetishization. Top-grossing movies and the highest-rated video games are all violent and correlate to weaponry. Entertainment, such as Top Gun and Modern Warfare, are all examples of the transition into a hyper-reality. This ideology pivots the focus of American society to violence and its reliance on guns. As American society is a hyper-reality from its fetishization and media, it portrays how violence is becoming the main source of entertainment. Especially regarding video games, many individuals desire realism in these video games from the fetishization of violence and weaponry. The hyper-reality state of America provides an insight into how society cannot discern what is real and what is imaginary. The article provides evidence into how weaponry is becoming their form of reality. Entertainment systems, like violent video games, are fueling their obsession. From the limited data and research, I did an interview with some of my friends. I interviewed 10 different individuals through the form of a survey. From the survey, all of them stated they were angry and showed signs of an increase in emotion while playing these violent video games. 4 of the individuals stated that they threw something because of the powerful invoked emotions. The data is biased, as it is a certain group of individuals who are categorized as gamers. Still, it provides an insight into how these powerful emotions in realistic games correlate to violence in real life. The research shows that realistic games have been invoking more powerful emotions like hatred and violence. Almost 40% of those participating in my research have thrown something while playing these video games. Whether it is the mouse or the keyboards, this significant data portrays a correlation between the violent video games and violence. Although research neglects specific examples and focuses on the aftermath of playing video games, my research signifies that there is some sort of correlation between violent video games and violence. This is the third app. I will now go to the fourth app, cel-shaded animation. Games such as Valorant purposely make their video games more friendly by not incorporating the blood and make it seem too realistic. Rather than realism, it focuses on an animation between something realistic and cel-shaded animation. Cel-shaded animation is non-photorealistic designs that make the animation and characters look more like a cartoon. Although it focuses on cel-shaded animation, it still revolves around the certain aspect of reaching realism through a false reality. In recent trends, first-person shooters have been the focal point for many developments. Most of its users prefer these games and desire realism in these games. First-person shooter games are where you are the character and hold the gun. The first-person shooter games make the game more realistic and immerses the users. It makes the users seem like they are the characters, and these games often revolve around realism. Study gives an insight into how audio-visual realism does positively relate to enjoyment, Danielle's 30. Regardless, many games are focusing on cel shading. For instance, games like Valorant and League of Legends are the most popular games right now. Recent research has determined 3 different outcomes of video games and violence. It may directly affect their tendency to become violent. They might not participate in other activities because of their inclination to play games, and children who play these violent games are a selective group of children. Susie Delt 3. Many individuals replace their violent inclination by playing violent video games. Those who play violent video games are also grouped into a category where they can be violent in the game together. Research also portrays that realistic video games affect and evoke their emotions. From the research, it is evident that the video games have become a replacement for violence. Although many individuals show signs of raging, it does not affect their actions and inclinations throughout the day. From the media's negative connotation on video games, research has become available. Still, the rapid developments of video games have limited the information regarding technology. Fornes 6, Drummond 6. Research has first been focused on 2D video games and has transitioned into virtual reality games. From the limited data, most of the research done states that there is no distinction in video games and violence. There was virtually no relationship between the employed measures of aggression, cognition, hostile affect, and aggressive behaviors, Drummond 5. As research was based on an older version of games, it neglects how the most realistic games evoke powerful emotions. Research conducted on horror games give an insight into how the brain reacts to a false reality. As the brain cannot determine whether it is reality, it reacts by believing it is reality. It invokes powerful emotions such as fear. From the increase in the fear levels, many individuals portray realistic scenarios of how they would react in real life. Coping mechanism is apparent from their reactions to these video games, Fornes 5. The heightened emotions give an insight into how the brain determines this false reality. 4 is 5. The heightened emotions bridge the gap in whether powerful emotions are evoked when playing video games. The research also determines that fear in the horror genre of video games also affected some of its users after the research. 4 is 5. The fear-evoked emotions influenced their sleep, and some users even had nightmares after playing the video games. This gives an insight into how powerful virtual reality video games have become, as it influences their emotions even after playing these games. Although emotions do not correlate to actions, it portrays the significance of video games and its effects on reality. It bridges the gap in the correlation between video games and emotions. From the powerful emotions, it portrays how anger is evoked when playing these violent video games. The heightened emotions when playing violent video games portrays how the users cannot distinguish reality from the video games, especially with new technology that replaces the 2D versions of these games. How the users uncertain about what is reality when it's immersed in the games. Even after playing these games, it has affected the users outside of the video games. Some users even reported that they have experienced frightened dreams and had powerful fear-invoked emotions after they played the game. The powerful effects of virtual reality games indicate that powerful emotions are evoked from playing these games. Regardless, the research does not portray a direct connection between becoming fearful of these games. Rather, it portrays the correlation between the emotions portrayed in the video games. The current research only determines the outcome of the emotions, not the increase in violence. The uncertainty of how video games will develop may change how video games are perceived. Yet, the research provides that violence does not lead to violent behaviors. The false articles online creates a negative connotation of the concepts of violent video games. From the research, there is a distinct correlation between video games and violence. Regardless, my research does not state that video games cause violence. Rather, it portrays a correlation between violent video games and invoked emotions. The awareness of reality and this false reality, as virtual reality is developing, portrays the route of violent video games in the future. The user's emotion of violence and anger may be influenced by video games, as there is no distinction between the game and reality. Still, violent video games may be beneficial in the future, as research determined that it may be a substitute for violence in real life. Although the users have heightened emotions while playing video games, they might utilize the game to be a substitute for their anger. The ideology and concepts regarding violent video games are too underdeveloped and too limited to predetermine what will occur in the future. From the research, it cannot be concluded that there is a significant data or evidence to determine the correlation between violence and violent video games. Yet, it is easy to determine the route of violence correlation with violent video games. Baudrillard's concepts of hyperrealism correlates to the understanding of how video games are going to affect these adolescents, as it cannot discern what is true and false because of the mixture of reality and the imaginary. Video games have no restrictions regarding the law, and it is not considered reality. Regardless, from the research, it is impossible to discern if there is a correlation between violence and violent video games. There is not enough data nor distinct evidence to conclude that violence stems from violent video games. This is a citation that I used throughout the presentation. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation.